So, um, well, today we have Oliver Lindau, also known as Veto, in the demo scene, invited for an interview. Um, well, if you would like to introduce yourself a bit, who you are and what you do, and what you did in your past life before the scene.
Well, yeah, okay. I'm Oliver, and I'm usually working as a system administrator, and but I used to be a computer games graphic um, in the early 90s, actually, and still I do some graphics, and for about 5 years from now on, I think, I returned to the demo scene on the C64, and yeah, I do some full screen graphics and some demos for some time also, and yeah, that's it mostly.
hmm So how did you become actually a graphican for commercial games? How did that start? How did that happen?
Oh, well, it was in the end of the 90s when I always tried to do something with game graphics also, but my problem always was that I lived in an area with where only villages. There were no major companies. There were no sceners or something like that. But I tried to get in touch with people, and so I contacted the Aktueller Softwaremarkt. It was about 1988 or 1989 or so, and I used to know the person called Ulrich Mühl. He was the guy who did mostly things like reviews or also if readers write letters or something like this, and so I and he knew many people in the commercial games companies, and so I get in touch with different people, mostly from Infernal Bytes or Magic Bytes, where I started to work with, and yeah, that was how it's became.
hmm And you said the end of the 80s, so that's actually the end of the C64 area when you realized that in that moment there was already the Amiga. So was the C64 your first system you made graphics for, or did you also make graphics for other systems like the Amiga or Atari or something?
It's a bit interesting because those days I tried to do Amiga graphics mostly. The C64 was my first system, and I mostly did graphics for this, but I always tried to do Amiga graphics for games. But the days I started in the commercial game companies, there were not much good C64 graphics around. There were some, like the example guys.
hmm
I think of Thomas Heinrich and Michael Detert. Now he's known as Michael Satzer. Um, and some other people like Dario Krobat, who's also known as Gotcha in the scene. Um, but there weren't many, and so I mostly got jobs for C64, and this is what's happened then. But in fact, I always tried to do more Amiga. It was a major system those days,
hmm
but but I didn't get much jobs for this.
The most known game you did graphics for was Rolling Ronnie, actually.
Yep.
And what are the other games? I mean, in Lemon, for example, there are not so much games listed. Maybe 5 games with graphics from you.
Well, the other big game I did graphics for was the Second World, which was some kind of economic simulation in in the future. It was more like the game Kaiser. Um, it was also relative successful. The first game I did graphics for was Mindbender, which was actually the second part of the game Deflector. It was not that good, but for me it was interesting because it was the first time I had to do some graphics in just 4 colors and to think of special restrictions. The, some things like color also was more in theory. I had to do some extra lists where to put which color in which block and such things, and this was quite interesting those days. And also it was interesting because it was the first time I did something with people I only knew from magazines, because this game was done, for example, by Georg Brandt, who was known as musicians those days.
Ah, okay. So, speaking about the limitations, how do you cope with those limitations? I mean, it must be pretty hard to make a good-looking graphic if you only have, as I said, 4 colors, or in most cases 16 colors. So, how do you cope with that limitation?
Um, I even don't think about those limitations anymore. When I started with them, it was more for fun because I didn't know anything others. When I started with graphics, I only knew the Koala Painter and tried something like this, made some sketches for games that never would have happened, where I thought how to do them. And some days later, it was the shoot 'em up construction kit, when I remember correctly. This was the days when I learned those restrictions really for things like character-based graphics, which was mostly for game backgrounds. And this was also when I had to learn how to manage just a limited number of sprites for animations and things like that. But it was nothing I really cared about, because um, when you start with such things, everything is new. Everything is much. It's quite a quantity for you when you start from nothing, and so well, it with the time it became better and better, and well, I was also fortunate because the coders which I had to deal with were very talented, and so I had good time, and but I really didn't had to think about those restrictions. This became this I did very very late. I think when I returned to the scene, this was the first time I really cared about limitations, when I started with high-res graphics and such things.
Ah, okay. So, um, what is the typical way of starting graphics for a game? I mean, there must be somebody like a game designer or a manager who tells you how he wants the game to look.
It's different. Those in the early 90s, it was mostly about conversions, ports of Amiga games, and so you had to manage the existing graphics to 8-bit. Sometimes it was different, but then you had to talk to the coder mostly. There were no, I think there were no real game designers those days. It was mostly the coder who had an idea, who had an inspiration, mostly from Japanese jump and run or so. Um, and then you started. I just used my tools. The first time I tried real C64 game graphics, this was indeed Rolling Ronnie. Um, it was kind of complicated because um, I used a traditional chassis editor. It was not really a game editor, and a friend of mine coded something to manage those in blocks, and then he coded another tool to get these blocks put in a level map. It was not really special. It was just for the moment, and well, then other things was I created those sprites for this game, and too many. I think about 20% of the sprites I pixeled for Rolling Ronnie never got into the game. Was always mostly was cut off here. This is too much. This is I don't know. There was something like, for example, for in one level it was a lamp, which looks a bit like well-known lamp, and the whole animation I think was about 20 frames, and at last there were about 4 frames in the game, and this was what happened mostly. So this was more the coder that did the restrictions for me.
Okay. So, did it ever happen to you that you did some graphics and you had to redo them because the result wasn't what they wanted from you?
No, because there was no time.
Ah, okay. So that's actually a good thing to speak about. What was the time frame, the time limitation you had for making the graphics for a game?
I'm sorry, but I didn't hear
I
you.
mean, I mean, what was the time frame you had to make the graphics for a game?
It was different. The shortest time I think was for games like Transworld, or those smaller things like Turnet or Think Cross. I think the shortest time I had was for Think Cross. It was about 3 weeks for 40 level sets, I think.
Ah, okay.
But sometimes it's completely different, because for the Rolling Ronnie we had as team we had about 3 months to complete the game, and the coder Mario and we had an arrangement that we worked just in time, because I prepared graphics. He just the day after put in his project, and so this is how it's worked.
I see. Um, so you said you also made sprite animations. What tool did you use for the sprite animations?
I used two different tools. For common multicolor, I used Zoic, the shoot 'em up construction kit, and to um, split them or save them individually, I used an action replay. The other tool I used was something which I found in the Magic Disc magazine. It's called Mob Profi. It was kind of interesting because you could do overlay sprites. The Rolling Ronnie sprite, for example, which is multicolor sprite plus high-res sprite, was done with it.
So that's quite interesting. Many commercial games were done with normal tools you could get as an end user too. You didn't have your own special tool specially made for you.
Later we had one special tool, because these for level backgrounds we had a follow-up of this mixture of tools, which was called MapAddy. The follow-up of MapAddy was also published on CSDBs a few years ago.
I see. Um, and how was it for you to work as a graphican? I mean, compared to composers, where the game was pretty much known because of the person who did the graphics. Sorry, I mean who did the music. I don't think it was the same case for the graphic guys. I mean, you didn't get so much credits or fame compared to composers. Could that be? Or is that a wrong impression I have?
This is true. It's totally true. I think there were very few graphic artists in those days, especially in the early 90s on the C64, which are really pretty well known. I think Gotcha was one of the very few.
Hmm. So, is there any role model, anybody you looked up to in the graphic area?
Yeah, definitely. I looked up to people like Michael Koseka, especially for his sprite animations. He did mostly graphics for games for Epics. He's well known for World Games, I think, and for Skate or Die from EA, such games. I loved his sprite animations. This was really excellent. And some others. One is more Amiga. It was Jim Sachs.
Hmm.
Um, in Europe, there were not that many. Well, I really looked up to Karen Davis. She wasn't that well known in the 80s. I don't think I knew her name even in those days. She did mostly graphics for Denton Designs or um, Special FX. Some people might remember the Firefly picture or the picture, the loading screen of Short Circuit, such things. Um, and yeah, and the other were. I also looked up for people like Hein Holt, who was really great, and some of the British artists. Um, I think Bob Stevenson, for example,
I see.
those guys.
You mentioned that you are active nowadays again in the scene. So how did that happen that you returned to the scene? And why did you even stop making graphics? Why didn't you just switch to other platforms and continuing doing graphics for games and stuff?
I think the main reason was in the early 90s a big disappointment with one project, which was a shoot 'em up game called Lethal Access. Um, Lethal Access was very ambitious. This was, I think, the first time we tried to do something with a huge multiplexer, um, about 45 sprites same time on screen, and levels which consists um, of three char sets and same time with color splits that this really looks very colorful, and we couldn't make it. Most reason was myself. I underestimated. Um, I think I had wrong feelings about how much effort had to put in this project, and um, well, we knew that when this really would have been done, it was it would have been something like a new Turrican, because the whole thing was so big, was what we wanted, and I think the mostly same with the coder. He also stopped his C64 activities after this project. This was really was kind of a trauma, I think, and and this was about 10 years when we even talked about it, the coder and I, to get it with what happened there, and um, well, for me it was also a financial disaster. and this is why I stopped activities there and got to different jobs and.
Mm.
Well,
So what are you doing nowadays?
uh, well, I work as system administrator. I I do mostly for one company. Mostly, I only work for one company now. I'm also am specialist for furniture
Mm.
and a completely different thing,
Ah, okay.
I guess.
So nothing to do with graphics at all.
Not at all.
But you returned to the demo scene as a graphic. How did that happen actually? I mean, who did you bring back to activity?
Um, First time that I checked that I mentioned that there is even C64 activities nowadays was about 2005 when I was on an event which was back in time in Hamburg, where I met some guys from the past, like the example guys, and there I also met MacGyver from Protovision, and this is when this all started again a bit. I met those Protovision guys on a meeting and started to do some minor graphics. Was kind of an animation for the game Packet. And then also already this project, I think it's even not finished yet. Um, then a few years I was also in Oblivion and did nothing, and it was I think 2008, and I had an own homepage and worked on a graphic for this homepage where I had a portrait of myself um, and wanted to publish this on his homepage. And MacGyver convinced me to send this picture to the BCC party. And I didn't. I have to say that those days I didn't even know much about CSDB and things. And MacGyver released the picture on CSDB, and I mentioned this, and I mentioned also those comments, and this was kind of interesting because I didn't think that anybody was really interested nowadays in such things. And shortly after this, there was the X Party. X Party 2008, and I gone there, and well, this was a blast, and I think this was the moment. You have to think about you're sitting in an audience. Was also already always also very exciting, and then there was this demo competition with Edge of Disgrace finally. And think about you didn't mention that there's no activity, and then you see Edge of Disgrace.
That's true, yes.
Yeah. And this was the moment when I think I was really back.
Yeah, I have to admit, it was really interesting to see you in action because actually, as we know, I was sitting on the same table next to you at the Revision demo party, and I remember when you submitted your graphic to the mixed graphic competition, and it was shown on the screen. And everybody was then coming to you and saying, "Yeah, this is probably the winner picture." And I remember you always said, "Oh no, maybe I take third place or maybe a good second place, but I don't think I will be the winner because other people made graphics in a different graphic mode, which has more colors, and so maybe my multicolor picture won't make it." So. And also something I noticed is that while I was sitting next to you, you still continued pixeling, even though the picture looked to the people outside pretty much finished. So I have to say you are very focused on your graphics. So, um, so how do you work on graphics nowadays? Because I also realized you are not using a C64 anymore. You were using a PC.
Yeah, and also a tablet. I think my pictures is something I do for myself mostly. And I do not compare my pictures with others, to be honest. For me, it's a different thing. First, what you mentioned, this that I thought that my picture wouldn't make it is because people who look at the big screen, most of those on revision do not know the restrictions really. They see the pictures, and I think it's mostly about the motive on the one hand, and but also of the overall view. And I mostly think an Amiga picture, um, a well done Amiga picture, and there were two really good Amiga pictures. It looks much better still compared to C64, and that's just mostly the reason why I think this. Another thing is that I still I'm not a graphician who learned it. I didn't study graphics. It's all self educated what I do. And so I don't take my own motives very serious. But I for me it's to challenge myself, and um, I still cannot compare my pictures with others. It's not possible for me. Um, the other thing is when when I work nowadays. I use a tool is called Timantis. It's a pixeling tool. It's based on the Windows graphic program Paint.net, which is enhanced with C64 functionality, and it's really good use because you have C64 restrictions. It's checked up for various modes, and you also have the possibilities to use layers, like from Photoshop also. And so for me, it's a good way to pixel in a natural way, and though something like those high restrictions, for example, you can do during the process. You can use a layer which is not restricted to test things, to try out some details, or some different views, or put in light, looks good, okay, and then you can reduce the colors, so everything looks fine. And this is how I work nowadays.
Okay. So, um, so let me ask you, when is a picture finished for you? I mean, I remember we spoke about that, and you said that many graphicians don't really pay attention to the details of a picture. At some point, they just say, "Okay, it's done." While you would say, "There is still a pixel here, a pixel there. I should improve or should change color of or something." So would you say you're working different from other people, from other graphic guys nowadays in the demo scene? Um, I mean, there are other people like JSL who does very much pictures in a little time frame.
JSL thing, I think, does mostly well. He does mostly pictures which are based on his own outlines. He does. I think I read that he mostly did some sketches, and he scanned the sketches of the outlines, and then he started pixeling. It's completely different because I completely developed the picture from the early beginning, and it's true. I focus much on details. For me, details um, are the key to my pictures. It's also they are also the key to my technique. There's something many people mentioned that the main thing about my pictures is that I don't use the dither technique. This isn't really true because I use some structures which are similar to dithering, but mostly when things do not match the restrictions, I think put another detail in there and then it would work. This is how this is probably the difference. But some other people do some similar things. I think about Joe from Wrath Designs and Crest. He also evolves his pictures with layers and in many stages, and it's I think it's kind of similar to those to things I do.
Nowadays, you count as one of the best or demo scene graphic guys next to DK and other people, as you mentioned. So, um, would you all say that the style changes when you have different life circumstances? Because I heard from other people who say that pictures also transport emotions, and if something changes in your life, then also your pictures change in style. Would you agree to that, or would you say that's not really true?
Probably yes. Um, I think about in the early 90s, I think my own pictures were quite bad. I wasn't very strong in compositions. I wasn't very strong in things like perspective, and so um, and I think even now I have some things I'm not really good at. Um, but there was for me there was a point I think in 2005 or 6 when I saw some videos about it was more like training videos for people working for movies. Um, and then I saw that is a very different thing to um, well, how should I say? It was something which is called visual storytelling. And this impressed me because the guy didn't talk about anything he was doing by his technique. It was like watching somebody who only talks about the history and background of the people he was drawing at the moment. And this is something I found very interesting because I think this is something where intentionally the picture gets sold. And this is what I tried also, and I think this was a moment when pictures became better, and I started those then more um, to get the mood, my own mood in those pictures, and I think this is something many really good graphicians do nowadays, and I think you also choose motives from 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 your situations because when you can identify with the picture you're doing, it's more fluid. You get a more fluid process, and this is I believe this is true.
So, speaking about motifs, how did you get the idea of making this picture Eye of the Storm, which was also the winner, as we mentioned earlier, of the Russian mixed demo competition, graphic competition? How did you get the idea for this motif? I mean, it's a squirrel in a storm. This is pretty unusual, I would say, as a motif.
Um, I have no idea. Um, to be honest, I have no idea. I chose a squirrel because I like those animals, and um, I was thinking about something in contrast, and somehow I composed it as some was like, and it's here.
Okay, so you have mentioned that you are doing graphics for Packet, which is a commercial game coming out hopefully this year, somewhere from Protovision. You also make graphics in the demo scene, and what I also learned is you also put up your own platform on the internet called C64Pixels.com. Could you tell us more about this? Why you started it and how you started it, and what's it that intention of this platform?
It was some years ago when I talked to Enthusi, and I think it was not at the beginning. It was not really a serious project. We were talking about game graphic galleries because there's nothing really like CSDB for graphics. There are things like HVSC for SID sounds. There are other platforms for music, and there are many platforms for games. When you're looking at games, there are also um, graphic galleries mostly. But really C64 graphics there was nothing. And those days I tried some um, various tools for web design, which is not so that more like open source things. And well, on one weekend I tried to do something with this gallery tool. Um, and well, this worked quite fine, and so Enthusi and me planned to do something bigger with it, and so the thing happened. It was about 2 weeks when we had about 60, 70 pictures, and it became more. And then was the day we set this to public, and we had a very good response for it, and so we continued. And I think 1 or 2 months later, um, we there was one new member in our team. This was Motion from from GameAid Inc. Um, and well, he also was very interested, and so this project grew. This year it's not so active at this platform because we are all very busy, but I think next year will be some modifications.
So, what are your plans for the future? I mean, you're already involved in a lot of projects. I mean, at least we heard about 3 things you're doing at the moment. Are there any future plans for your graphic skills?
Um, well, at the moment I'm working on a bigger demo project. This is why I couldn't do anything else now because we all had a life still. After this, I have no real plans. Something I really want to do is to get uh, more effort for C64 Pixels. but then I think I want to do my graphics more relaxed. It's the project at the moment it's a strong um, it's really I'm really busy with it, and I think that after this I need some vacation.
Okay, so as you were a graphic designer for games, and as we see at the moment, there are a lot of new games coming out on cartridges and on diskette from Cytronic and other companies. Um, like big games like Solus, which was just released in June, which really which really sold out after 4 weeks already. The first batch was already sold out, which is very graphic lastic and so on. So would you be interested in being involved in a big commercial C64 game again, like those games which are released nowadays?
Sure, but it has to be a relaxed project. Indeed.
So not such a limited time frame.
Indeed.
Okay. So is there anything else you would like to say um, to wrap up the interview? Because these are at the moment all the questions I have to you.
Well, I the only thing I can say is that I'm really glad that the C64 scene is so alive nowadays. It's always exciting see how creative this scene is, and I hope that it's not the only last 30 years, but hope that next year, 30 years, it's also so creative and that people will remember what we do nowadays.
And you try to stay active, I hope, for the future.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, so thank you for doing this interview with us. It was very interesting, and I wish you very much luck with your future projects
thank
and
you.
your future things you do on the C64 and the demo scene and so on.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.